valid
You can't park
handicap
here.
placard.
This is handicap parking.
I have a valid handicap placard displayed on the vehicle.
I need proof you're actually disabled.
I'm in an electric wheelchair, sir.
People fake disabilities all the time.
By the end of this encounter, a routine parking check would unravel a 6-year pattern of documented misconduct. Multiple cameras would preserve every word. Witnesses would refuse to disperse. And a single demand made in full public view would expose a failure so severe it could not be contained inside one department. The evidence would not come from investigation months later. It would come from what unfolded in plain sight while the camera kept recording. Before we go any further, let me know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you haven't already, consider subscribing.
It's early afternoon in downtown Seattle. A commercial building with 4 designated handicap parking spaces sits along a busy street. One of those spaces is occupied by a modified van with disabled plates. The side ramp is deployed. An electric wheelchair is positioned behind it. The man seated in that wheelchair is unloading architectural models for a scheduled meeting inside the building. His movements are measured, deliberate, practiced. This isn't hurried. This is routine. A patrol vehicle pulls in behind him. The officer exits. The camera angle from inside the building captures everything. The wheelchair, the ramp, the placard hanging from the mirror, the officer approaching anyway. What begins as a parking check immediately turns into something else. A demand is made, then repeated. Clarifications are ignored. The situation doesn't escalate because of resistance. It escalates because authority refuses to acknowledge what is directly in front of it. Within minutes, witnesses begin to gather. Phones come out. A security camera continues recording from above. The encounter is now being preserved from multiple angles, long before anyone involved understands what those recordings will later reveal. This is a reconstructed reenactment based on a real, publicly reported case. The van had arrived just before 2 o'clock. The driver parked carefully, centered between the lines of a clearly marked handicap space. Disabled plates were visible. A state-issued placard hung from the rearview mirror. The side ramp deployed smoothly, lowering to the pavement. The man operating the controls guided his electric wheelchair down the ramp and toward the back of the vehicle. Inside were scale architectural models, presentation materials, and samples arranged for a meeting scheduled an hour later. He had arrived early on purpose. Unloading took time. Precision mattered. From the street, there was nothing unusual about the scene, except that a patrol car slowed as it passed. The officer inside watched for a moment, then pulled in behind the van. When the officer stepped out, he did not acknowledge the wheelchair. He did not comment on the ramp. He did not reference the placard or the plates. His first words were immediate and directive. "You can't park here. This is handicap parking." The man in the wheelchair looked up, confused. He gestured toward the windshield where the placard was clearly visible. He explained calmly that he was legally parked. The response did not address the placard. Instead, the officer demanded proof, not of the vehicle, but of the man. Proof that he was actually disabled. This footage would later be reviewed frame by frame. The request hung in the air, absurd in its context. The man was seated in a high-end electric wheelchair. His legs were positioned motionless in the footrests. The controls were visible at his armrest. Nothing about the setup was concealed. When the man pointed this out, the officer dismissed it. He claimed that people often fake disabilities to use these spaces. The implication was clear. The visible evidence was not enough. The officer then issued a command that made the situation unmistakable. He ordered the man to step away from the vehicle. The man explained, again calmly, that he could not. That was the purpose of the wheelchair. The officer repeated the order anyway. Inside the building, a security guard had been watching the interaction unfold on the monitors. He recognized the man in the wheelchair from previous visits. He exited the lobby with his phone already recording. From the sidewalk, pedestrians began to slow. They saw the same thing the cameras saw: a man in a wheelchair being questioned about whether he belonged in a space designed specifically for him. The officer did not disengage. He did not reassess. He did not call a supervisor. Instead, he doubled down on the demand, treating compliance as a matter of authority rather than legality. At this point, the officer believed the situation was still under control. The man in the wheelchair did not raise his voice. He did not argue about authority. He repeated facts, slowly, clearly, as if clarity alone would resolve the misunderstanding. He explained that the placard was state-issued, that the plates were registered, that the wheelchair was not decorative. The officer did not acknowledge any of it. Instead, he reframed the situation as a compliance issue. He insisted on inspecting documentation beyond what the law required. He treated the explanation as avoidance rather than information. A building security guard stepped closer, his phone held steady. He identified the man by name, explained that he was a scheduled visitor, and confirmed that he had seen him arrive in the same wheelchair many times before. The officer dismissed the guard, told him to step back, claimed the matter was police business. A woman walking past stopped. She looked from the wheelchair to the placard, then back to the officer. She asked what the problem was. The officer told her to move along. Another pedestrian stopped, then another. Phones came out. The sidewalk filled with quiet disbelief. No one was shouting. No one was interfering. They were watching. The man in the wheelchair activated his own camera. He identified himself for the record. He stated his legal status. He stated that he was recording for his protection. The officer ordered him to turn the camera off. The man declined. He cited his right to record a public official in a public space. The officer stepped closer. The distance narrowed. The tone hardened. Each refusal is now a recorded decision. Policy violations are already documented. The officer reached toward the phone. The man pulled it back. The crowd reacted, not with outrage, but with audible confusion. Someone laughed nervously at the sheer contradiction of what they were witnessing. A man in a business suit emerged from the building entrance. He recognized the man in the wheelchair immediately. This was the architect he was scheduled to meet. He asked what was going on. The explanation was brief. The officer was demanding proof of disability. The man in the suit looked again at the wheelchair, the ramp, the placard, the plates, the witnesses. His confusion turned to anger. He demanded a justification. None came. The officer responded by threatening citations for obstruction. The threat only drew more attention. The camera stayed up. The witnesses stayed put. A supervisor was requested. Dispatch was notified. The timeline was now locked. From this moment forward, every action was being preserved. The patrol car remained parked behind the van as the crowd settled into place. No one left. No one advanced. The sidewalk had become an informal record room. Civilians standing shoulder to shoulder, phones held at chest height, documenting an interaction that no longer belonged to the officer controlling it. 9 minutes after the supervisor was requested, a second patrol vehicle arrived. The supervisor exited and did not need an explanation. The scene explained itself. A man seated in an electric wheelchair, a deployed ramp, disabled plates, a placard clearly visible through the windshield, a ring of witnesses quietly recording, an officer standing rigid, defensive, unwilling to disengage. The supervisor asked for a summary. The officer described a verification issue. The explanation ended there. The supervisor looked again, deliberately this time. She examined the wheelchair, the immobile legs, the controls, the vehicle markings. She asked one question that reframed everything. What exactly required verification? There was no answer. She turned to the man in the wheelchair and apologized. She stated clearly that he was legally parked and free to continue his business. That sentence alone shifted the balance. Authority had changed hands. The man acknowledged the apology, then stated his intent to file a formal complaint. He did not speak emotionally. He listed actions: being ordered to prove a visible disability, being commanded to step away despite clear paralysis, being told to stop recording. The supervisor documented every word. Witnesses stepped forward without being asked. The building security guard provided his footage. The developer provided his statement. Pedestrians volunteered their names and recordings. From this moment on, there was no version of events where this ended quietly. The officer was instructed to return to his vehicle. He complied without protest. The shift in posture was visible. Control had given way to containment. Inside the building, the meeting still happened. The architect completed his presentation. The project discussion moved forward as scheduled. Outside, the incident continued moving, but now on paper, on video, and across internal channels that no longer involve discretion. Internal Affairs opened a review the following morning. Body-worn cameras, civilian footage, security feeds, dispatch logs, all synchronized, all consistent. The investigation did not stop with the incident. It widened. Citation histories were pulled. Complaint records re-examined. Patterns emerged that had previously been treated as isolated. Supervisors who had signed off on earlier dismissals were questioned. Hearing outcomes were compared. Demographics were analyzed. The data no longer supported coincidence. The interaction that began as a parking check had triggered institutional exposure. The evidence did not rely on interpretation. It relied on repetition. There was no internal explanation that could undo what had already occurred. The investigation concluded faster than expected. The evidence required no reconstruction. Every critical moment already existed on video, captured from multiple angles, accompanied by audio that left no ambiguity. Internal Affairs reviewed the officer's full enforcement record. Over 6 years, dozens of handicap parking citations had been issued under his name. When compared against departmental averages, the disparities were immediate. Contest rates far exceeded norms. Dismissal rates were abnormally high. Patterns appeared when the data was broken down by race and disability type. The review uncovered 12 prior complaints alleging improper demands for medical proof, dismissive treatment of visible and invisible disabilities, and selective enforcement. Each complaint had been closed individually. None had triggered pattern analysis. That failure now became part of the record. The officer was terminated within 72 hours of the incident. The department cited documented misconduct, constitutional violations, and failure to adhere to disability accommodation law. The case was referred to federal authorities. Prosecutors reviewed the footage, the citation history, and the internal findings. Federal charges followed for deprivation of rights under color of law. The officer entered a guilty plea. He was sentenced to a term of incarceration, supervised release, and permanently barred from future law enforcement employment. Civil action proceeded in parallel. The lawsuit named both the officer and the city. The claims included violations of the Americans with Disabilities Act, civil rights deprivation, and institutional failure to intervene despite documented warning signs. The city did not contest liability. The evidence made litigation unnecessary. A settlement was reached within weeks. Monetary compensation was approved, accompanied by mandatory and non-financial terms. Those terms required department-wide ADA training, revised enforcement protocols, supervisory review of disability-related complaints, and public release of handicap parking citation data spanning a decade. Oversight mechanisms were installed. Audit schedules were mandated. The data release exposed additional officers with similar enforcement patterns. Disciplinary action followed. Policy changes were implemented. Federal monitoring remained in place until compliance benchmarks were met. The incident reshaped enforcement standards beyond one department. Other cities reviewed their own citation data. Training models were revised. Disability advocacy organizations incorporated the footage into national programs. The man in the wheelchair continued his work. His professional standing remained intact. His role expanded into advisory and policy spaces. His case became a reference point for accountability, not because of who he was, but because the evidence never blinked. The record spoke for itself. What followed could not be undone.